So I'm recording this on November 18th, 2020. It is the day of the NBA draft. I'm recording this around 11:20 a.m. Eastern Time, just in case any other news breaks before this podcast is uploaded. And so on this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be talking about James Harden wanting to leave Houston. I'm going to touch on some of the things that Milwaukee has done with regard to trades, go over a little bit of NBA futures bets for, Eastern Conference champion, Western Conference champion, NBA champion for the 2020-2021 season, and maybe the 2021 MVP award. And I might even throw out some mock trades that could potentially happen in the coming days. So I'm going to start out with James Harden here. James Harden has requested a trade out of Houston. He apparently only wants to go to Brooklyn because he worked out with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. It's kind of funny, but I think that if those three were on a team together, it would be three of the most difficult personalities and confusing personalities to work with. So I'm not sure what kind of chemistry that team would have. And on top of that, I don't know exactly what the Brooklyn Nets would have to give up to get James Harden. So before any of that, I kind of want to take a step back and just say that I think it's bogus that James Harden is requesting a trade. As far as I'm concerned, the Rockets have done everything possible to make James Harden's life easy. They tried to bring him Chris Paul, and it didn't quite work out. They've surrounded him with shooters. They've had him under a coach in Mike D'Antoni, who has literally inflated Harden's stat line by letting Harden do everything offensively for the Houston Rockets. Over the past few years, it's been one of the most boring teams to watch because a lot of the role players just stand around the three-point line and let Harden, isolate and win his matchup. So Harden's been given a lot. And the other thing that's kind of important to keep in mind here is that Harden is the one who wanted to bring Westbrook in initially. So it's not like Daryl Morey was dying to have one of the most inefficient shooters in the NBA and Russell Westbrook on this team. And so now, what's understandable is that, okay, D'Antoni has left, Daryl Morey has left this offseason, but to me, Harden still has the team that he essentially requested initially. And Harden is also the one who signed the contract that he's currently making money from. And so looking at James Harden here, he's 31 years old. For the 2020-2021 season, he's going to make over $40 million. The following year, almost $44 million. And then for the 2022-2023 season, he has a $46.8 million player option. As far as I'm concerned right now, the Houston Rockets should definitely not be trading James Harden, and I don't think they will be. I think this was actually really poorly planned by Harden. I think that, at least with the Davis thing, there was like a timing aspect to it where it was like, yeah, I'm going to be a free agent soon. You guys don't want to lose me for nothing. With this Harden thing, it's like he just wants to leave for the sake of leaving because he worked out with Durant and Kyrie and he's friends with those guys. And, as far as I'm concerned, like, the team currently is constructed to help him be the best player possible. And the Rockets, being as good as they were for many years and, the Rockets' shortcomings in the playoffs, all of it kind of goes back to, like, it's Harden. Harden's fingerprints are all over the team in terms of outcome. So, just brainstorming, a lot of people are mentioning, like, what's the best offer Brooklyn could throw out there? I mean, realistically, what is it? 3 first-round picks, 3 pick swaps, and then Karis LeVert and Spencer Dinwiddie? I mean, to me, that trade is not good enough if you're Houston. And part of the reason why is because the Rockets don't have their own picks in the next 2 seasons, in the next 2 off seasons, I guess, because they traded for Westbrook, because they took Westbrook's contract, because Harden wanted them to do that. So I'm sure that Harden's not really considering the team aspect as much, but there's no way that this is an optimal move for Houston. I think that it's much more likely that the Rockets retain James Harden because he's under contract instead of moving him. And I think that if they do retain Harden, they're probably going to be like a team that competes for a playoff spot. I don't think they're a championship contender, but I don't really see why Houston would have any incentive to move James Harden. The only wild card that I'll throw out there is if Ben Simmons happens to be the centerpiece of a very large 76ers offer. That would be the one thing that I could see as a possibility. But of course, Harden's under contract for the next 2 years. He's got a player option after that. There's going to be a lot of time for other teams to step up and make offers for James Harden's contract. And a lot of those teams could be different from Brooklyn because the teams actually have some security now, because it's like, well, Harden's going to be under contract for the next 2 years and then he has a player option. So there is like some incentive, I think, for other teams to start bidding. And for that reason, I just would not part ways with a superstar of that caliber at this moment if I'm Houston. So while we're on the topic of the Houston Rockets, I might as well point out that Westbrook also requested a trade, probably because he knew Harden was going to request a trade. It's kind of funny because I think a few days before Westbrook officially requested his trade, a report came out saying the Rockets are, willing to part ways with Westbrook's contract. And I was just thinking, like, yeah, no kidding. Westbrook is, let's see here, Russell Westbrook, 32 years old. He makes $41 million this year. He makes $43.8 million the following year. And then in the 2022-2023 season, $46.6 million player option. Look, I like Westbrook as a player. I think that his intensity is admirable, but he's just become such a bad shooter. The shooting has declined so much. The decision making isn't always there. I just feel like there's so much like egotistical energy with him where it just all kind of nosedives in the playoffs, and he's always in this downward spiral. Just a lack of poise with the ball sometimes in big moments. Sometimes he's almost a little bit too energetic and is a little bit like out of control. His athleticism is almost moving quicker than his mind is on the court. And I just feel like sometimes, his intensity kind of goes the other way on him. And, it just turns into kind of a mess sometimes, as we saw with the Rockets in the second round against the Lakers this past year. Now, of course, he may have been recovering from his injury. And I got to give Westbrook credit. He did play really well down the stretch before the season got canceled. So I think that Westbrook does hold some value as a player, but his contract is so enormous and so egregious that I don't actually feel like he's a movable player at this point. There's very few teams in the league who I think would be interested in a guy like Westbrook. And I think even the teams who could take him are not going to be willing to pay very much at all. In fact, I think that Houston could potentially have to pay something for it. But so anyway, one team that I wanted to throw a mock trade out with, if Houston and Charlotte made a deal. Charlotte is one of the few teams who can actually afford to take Westbrook's contract and stay under the luxury tax. And if you're the Hornets, I don't think this is necessarily a good idea. I think that, it's kind of a good year to be bad because the 2021 draft class looks to be a pretty good one. But if you're Charlotte and you're looking for a star player who can, bring some attention to a team that has been very forgettable over the past few years, this could be a move. And I know that Michael Jordan, probably one of the more impulsive owners, probably likes Westbrook, probably thinks he's, still a star player. So in this mock trade, I have the Hornets acquiring the 32-year-old Russell Westbrook, and in exchange, the Rockets take Terry Rozier's contract. Rozier, 26 years old. He's got $19 million this year, $18 million the year after that. I have the Rockets taking a flyer on Malik Monk, who's only 22 years old. And then I have the Rockets getting a 2022 second-round pick. So it would be one of those deals where Charlotte may be one of the few teams who wouldn't demand the Rockets giveaway picks to take the Westbrook contract off their hands. So, if the Hornets actually do value Westbrook as a legitimate asset and a player who can, bring some attention to their franchise, then they could make this as like the highest bid compared to other teams like Detroit, the Knicks, teams like that who I just don't think would be as interested. I feel like with Detroit, they have the cap space, but, you know, if they actually brought in Westbrook and they also had Blake Griffin, I think that low key that team would be a little bit too good to be like a team that's tanking. And again, this is a good year to be bad. I don't think it'd be a playoff team, but I think that they would come in like 12th or something in the Eastern Conference instead of like, 15th, which is where I think they might go now. And then I guess finally, just to kind of wrap up on the Westbrook thing, there are people saying that the Clippers are interested in Westbrook. I think that that's a smokescreen by the Rockets to kind of show interest that, or to kind of like, give the illusion that there's interest in Russell Westbrook around the league. Steve Ballmer loves to throw money out, but I don't think even he would want Westbrook's contract. The only way a deal like that would go through is if Kawhi Leonard legitimately wanted Westbrook more than Paul George, which would be really funny on multiple, like just very ironic on multiple levels. If those two were traded for each other, it would just be incredible that like the 7 first-round picks from Oklahoma City that went to Oklahoma City or whatever, not 7, but like, I think there were 4 plus like 3 pick swaps or something. All of that would eventually turn into Russell Westbrook. But anyway, that's probably not going to happen. I think that the Clippers are going to go after someone a little bit more attainable and probably helpful to their team, like Rajon Rondo, to address the point guard position. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to talking about Milwaukee. So I don't know what the market was for Giannis. I don't know what kind of offers were coming in for a Giannis trade. I respect the fact that they're going for a title this year, but their strategy is extremely risky. Obviously, without the fans in the seats this year, everyone is looking to kind of move away from the luxury tax, and they have avoided it as well with some of the trades they've made. But Giannis is 25 years old, final year of his contract. The Bucks are a small market team. I think that they have done a decent but not amazing job of building around Giannis. They've been a very successful team, regular season-wise, 1 seed each of the past 2 years. Made it to the Eastern Conference Finals 2 years ago. Lost in the semifinals this past season. They're close, but I think that Milwaukee may have made a mistake here with one of the trades they pulled off most recently. At a more fundamental level, I wanted to point out that Milwaukee has built around Giannis as if he's James Harden in Houston. They've brought in Budenholzer as the coach. They've got all these shooters surrounding Giannis, and Giannis has even increased his amount of three-point attempts. I don't think it's a bad idea for Giannis to have the ability to attempt a three-pointer, but I think that Milwaukee may have kind of missed the point on exploiting Giannis's biggest advantage that he has over teams. I just think that if I'm a team defending Giannis, him standing at the three-point line is exactly what I want. He's shooting, around 30% now, up from, I think, 25.5% it was last year. I think the way to use Giannis a little bit more effectively is if Milwaukee had a point guard that could just have pick and rolls to the basket with Giannis. I think that's kind of the way for Giannis to be used as effectively as possible. And so I'm going to get into their trades in a minute. They obviously traded for Drew Holiday. They traded for Bogdanovich. I was kind of hoping that the Bucks would maybe, do a separate deal. They could have shipped out Bledsoe, and then I was kind of hoping they would sign a guy like Goran Dragic or Rajon Rondo, someone who could really unlock Giannis as a guy who can just run to the basket. I don't think he has to be someone who stands outside at the three-point line. I don't think that Milwaukee's, strategy has been bad necessarily. Analytically, it's been fine. They've been a very good team. But ultimately in the playoffs, I think that they could use that point guard who has the ability to unlock Giannis as a guy that runs to the basket. So just going over the trades that Milwaukee made, I want to talk about the Drew Holiday trade. So if I didn't know this trade happened and you told me, the Bucks made a trade where they gave up Eric Bledsoe, George Hill, 3 first-round picks and 2 pick swaps. I would have thought that the Bucks just got James Harden, not Drew Holiday. Look, I like Drew Holiday. I think he's a good player. He's a nice player. He's a good defender. He can pass. He's got a good handle. He can play on and off the ball. But here is Drew Holiday's contract situation. He's 30 years old. He makes $26 million this year. He's got a $27 million player option for next year. He's a guy who's been injured a lot over the course of his career. Obviously, there was a shortened season this year, so he only played 61 games this past season. But the years prior to that, I'm just going to list in reverse order the amount of games he's played. 67, 81, 67, 65, 40, 34, 78, 65, 82, and 73. There's another little thing with Holiday here where people kind of think he's Buddy Hield from behind the three-point line, but he's not. Here are his three-point percentages in each of the past 3 seasons. 35%, 32.5%, and 33.7%. His career average from 3 is only 35.3%. I think he's one of the most overrated three-point shooters. And, you know, I know that the Bucks are trying to make Giannis happy, but to me, this is one of the worst outcomes that could happen for Milwaukee because this is a panic trade. This is what the Timberwolves did at the trade deadline when they traded Andrew Wiggins and almost an unprotected first-round pick in 2021. I think it's top 3 protected. I mean, that 2021 first-round pick could be like the 5th overall pick for Minnesota, and now it's going to Golden State. I think that's one of Golden State's most valuable assets now, outside of their top players. On top of that, I thought that Wiggins was about as good as D'Angelo Russell when the trade happened, and I actually thought that Wiggins probably fit in better with Golden State's top 2 guys, just because he could play the 3, he could defend a little bit better, and there's a little more versatility with him. I feel similarly about this trade where, like, the Pelicans are just stacking up 3 first-round picks and 2 pick swaps, and then they also get Bledsoe and George Hill. I don't know if Bledsoe and George Hill as a combination is that much worse from Drew Holiday straight up. So I clearly have a much lower opinion of Drew Holiday than the NBA does, or at least that the Milwaukee Bucks do. But I laid out the numbers. I mean, he's not that good of a three-point shooter. He is a good defender. He's a good passer, but hasn't always been healthy. He's 30 years old. I just don't really get it. I thought that was one of the most egregious trades of the offseason so far. On a lighter note, I thought that Milwaukee did a really good job with the Bogdanovich trade. I think that Sacramento came up a little bit short here. They, in exchange for Bogdanovich and Justin James, the Kings are getting DiVincenzo, Ilyasova, and DJ Wilson. I think the Kings got kind of a lowball value there for Bogdanovich, who I think is clearly the best player in that deal. I guess this means Buddy Hield won't be getting moved, or maybe he still will be, but that was a weird trade. I thought Sacramento got a little shortchanged there, so I didn't like that deal for the Kings. I think the Bucks are getting an improvement there. So look, ultimately, I think that Milwaukee's in a really difficult position. My overarching point here, though, is that there are rumblings about Giannis wanting to leave already. Okay, there were already rumblings, and so I think the smart thing for Milwaukee to do, and this is something that they probably have already considered doing, is that they need to kind of, read the tea leaves around the organization. Is Giannis really going to leave? They need to talk to him. They need to figure it out. According to these trades, it sounds like they're a little desperate, because I just feel like the Drew Holiday trade was meant to appease Giannis, similarly to how the Timberwolves were trying to appease Karl-Anthony Towns by, kind of just short selling Andrew Wiggins and a really valuable draft pick, only in exchange for D'Angelo Russell, who is a nice player, but again has some key flaws, doesn't get to the free throw line, and doesn't play very much defense at all. It's just rare for a small market team to kind of unexpectedly re-sign a star player as good as Giannis. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to, kind of discuss now further a little bit of the other notable trades that have happened so far this offseason. So both of them involve Oklahoma City. The Thunder have traded Dennis Schroeder to the Lakers in exchange for Danny Green and a 2020 first round pick. I think the Thunder get more value in a vacuum in this trade. I have kind of gone back and forth on Schroeder. I think that he played really well for Oklahoma City in the playoffs and down the stretch this past season, but I think in the past, Schroeder is someone who has not always had the greatest decision making, and he hasn't always been a great shooter. At least in LA, he'll probably be coming off the bench. My concern about this deal for the Lakers is that if they're thinking that they're going to replace Rajon Rondo with Dennis Schroeder, that's a big downgrade. That's a really big downgrade in terms of IQ and in terms of passing ability. Schroeder's a good player, but I think that they paid a premium for him. I mean, a first round pick plus Danny Green. I know that Danny Green didn't play well last year, but to me, Danny Green for Schroeder 1-for-1 is relatively fair. I guess that Schroeder gives you more flexibility because he's in the last year of his contract, but yeah, this is a trade that I think a little bit of a red flag for the Lakers. I think that they're definitely going to be a worse team if they lose Rondo this offseason. And so the other bigger trade here, the Phoenix Suns acquire Chris Paul. They give up Kelly Oubre, Ricky Rubio, Ty Jerome, Jalen Leck, and a 2022 first-round pick. So again, this is just the Thunder kind of wheeling and dealing. They acquire multiple first-round picks to acquire Chris Paul initially, along with getting rid of Westbrook's contract, and now they're acquiring another pick to get rid of Chris Paul, along with some other pretty good assets. I think that this deal is pretty fair. I think it's pretty solid on both sides. I think the Thunder probably get more value in a vacuum. I would have liked this deal more for Phoenix if they just hadn't gotten rid of Oubre, who I think was a really solid player for them. But anyway, I think Phoenix was a team I was coming around on anyway a little bit. I think that even if they hadn't made this deal, I would have thought this is a team that's going to be improved and will probably compete for a playoff spot in a competitive Western Conference. Now that they've acquired Chris Paul, the starting lineup for the Suns now looks like Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Michael Bridges, Dario Saric, and DeAndre Ayton. And I think that's a pretty good crunch time five. I think it's a team that fits well together. I think Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton will be great. I think Booker could be unleashed as a very good weapon. He may not be the primary point of emphasis for other teams defensively now that Chris Paul is there. And so I think that it's a nice team. I think they will be competing for the 8th spot in the Western Conference next year. On the flip side, I think the Thunder, they bring in some good players. Rubio probably had to be a part of the deal just to make the salaries work. And of course, as a fit, Rubio and Chris Paul would not fit together, and I don't think Rubio wants to come off the bench. Oubre's a nice player, good player for Oklahoma City. He's only 24 years old. The only downside to this trade, I think, for Phoenix, and I do like the aggressiveness, so I'm not knocking them for this trade. I think it's a good deal for them. But the only downside is that Chris Paul is 35. I liked Chris Paul going into last season a lot more than most people. I thought that the Thunder would not be a playoff team, but would be like a solid, tough out, like 10th seed or whatever in the West. Going into this year, I think that Chris Paul has become maybe a tiny bit overrated. I mean, he still does have that really difficult injury history, and he is 35 years old. It's a risk, but it's, I think, a calculated risk for Phoenix. They're only giving up one first-round pick, so I think it's a pretty good deal for them. So now I'm just going to spitball a couple other, potential mock trades that I could see happening in the future. Not as many left. I think that, a couple of the big ones have already happened, but I wanted to point out that I think the Bulls could be a team that could make some moves. They have a bunch of young assets that are kind of stockpiled, and I could see a new GM, new head coach combination coming in and kind of mixing things up. I think LaVine is on the block. I think that LaVine would be a fit with several teams. He's only making $19.5 million per year for each of the next 2 seasons, and he's 25 years old, so he might actually be a pretty valuable trade asset. I think that, Markkanen's a guy that I think teams are going to be calling about, and maybe even Wendell Carter gets thrown into a deal. So I think the Bulls have some young assets to kind of throw around. One mock trade that I threw out there that made more sense before the Kings got rid of Bogdanovich. The Kings would receive Zach LaVine, the Bulls would receive Buddy Hield, and the 12th overall pick, which I think would ultimately be a win for the Bulls because I think Hield is a really good, valuable guy who actually has a pretty affordable contract for each of the next 4 seasons, averaging around $20 million per season. And the 12th pick is, a decent asset. And I think even though it's a weaker draft class this year at the top, there might be some good guys right around the 12th spot this year. Another mock trade I wanted to throw out there is I think San Antonio might, cut bait with a couple of their older star guys. They're not really stars anymore, but, Aldridge and DeRozan I think could be on the move. DeRozan is 31 years old. He's in the final year of his contract, $27 million. I think it might be a player option he has. I have the Spurs trading DeRozan to Denver with the assumption that he's going to opt into his player option, and San Antonio receiving the 22nd overall pick this year from Denver, as well as Gary Harris's contract, which is $19 million this year, $20 million the following year. He's 26 years old. I just feel like if you're San Antonio, it would be better for you to win 25 games rather than 35 games in the upcoming season, especially with the Western Conference being pretty solid. We'll see what happens with Houston. Clearly, Oklahoma City is going to revert back to being a non-playoff team, but we'll see what ends up happening with the West. It looks like it's pretty solid across the board, though, with Golden State getting a lot better. You've got the 2 LA teams, Dallas, Denver, etc. So there's really, San Antonio is really in no man's land, and I think it would make sense for them to start moving out pieces. I don't think DeRozan is all that, valuable of a trade asset, but if they get an extra first rounder for him, they save a little bit of money, and they also help their chances of getting a higher pick next year. I could see San Antonio making a move like that. And so then a final trade I wanted to throw out, I think Indiana and Boston are two teams that are kind of made and destined to have a deal with one another. They have a lot of pieces that kind of fit together. So I wanted to throw this deal out. Indiana would receive Gordon Hayward, who is 30 years old, and he's got a $34 million player option this year. I also have the Pacers receiving picks 14 and 30 in this year's draft. The Celtics would retain pick 26. The Celtics have 3 first-round picks this year. I also have the Pacers receiving Robert Williams, first-round pick from a couple years ago, 23 years old, under contract for the next 2 years. I would have the Celtics receiving Victor Oladipo, 28 years old, $21 million. He's in the final year of his contract. And Miles Turner, who's 24 years old, and he's making $18 million a year for each of the next 3 seasons. I feel like this deal makes sense for both teams. Indiana is basically taking Hayward, who I think is a better fit alongside Sabonis than Turner was. And they also get 2 first-rounders and a guy like Robert Williams who they can take a flyer on. They save a little bit of money. Boston finally addresses their 5 by getting a guy like Miles Turner. And Victor Oladipo is a badass player when he's healthy. He's coming off of multiple major injuries, and he's getting a little older. He's 28 years old now, but he's still a good player when he's healthy. So as far as the fit in Boston, I mean, if this deal were to happen, you'd assume that the crunch time 5 would consist of Kemba Walker, Victor Oladipo, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and maybe Turner, I don't know, maybe Tice, depending on what the matchup is. I think that Boston would improve by doing this deal, and I think that it would be kind of a power move for them to kind of compete with all the rumors about Brooklyn wanting to acquire Harden, and obviously Milwaukee has made some splash moves this offseason. I'm not sure if Milwaukee actually got better, but then of course Miami, the very solid team that's just hanging around in the Eastern Conference, and Toronto as well. Boston, wanting to kind of stay competitive in what is a difficult Eastern Conference now. So I think that it makes sense for both teams. I think Indiana kind of resets while also keeping the core players of their team. I don't think Indiana was planning on re-signing Oladipo anyway, and I think, again, that Turner wasn't a great fit with them. Okay, so last but not least, I'm going to go over some NBA futures bets. So I'm going to start out with the Western Conference winner. So I'm going to read off the odds first. So the Lakers are at plus 175. The Clippers are at plus 300 to win the Western Conference. Golden State, I've seen anywhere from plus 350 all the way out to plus 500. The Dallas Mavericks, I've seen anywhere from plus 1400 out to plus 1700. The Nuggets are 14 to 1. The Rockets are 16 to 1, and I think the Rockets are actually a better bet to miss the playoffs than to win the Western Conference. Phoenix and Utah are both 20 to 1, and then after that it just kind of gets, ridiculous. So there's two teams that I really like. Golden State. If you can get them at plus 500 to win the Western Conference, I think Golden State is the best team in the West right now. I think they are going to surprise a lot of people, and I think they are better than both LA teams. I think they're a terrible matchup for a team like the Lakers with all the shooting. I think that a lot of people have just forgotten how successful Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, Steve Kerr, that's the core of the organization. Those guys are all still there. And I think Golden State has been really devalued in the market because they're coming off of a year where they had, I think, the second worst record in the NBA, and it's all because they didn't have their guys this past year. I think Andrew Wiggins, is a really good addition for them. I think he's solid. I think he's going to be in that Harrison Barnes role where he can make threes, he can play a little bit of defense, hopefully. I think he's in a really good position to be successful. I think his career could turn around a little bit. And I like this team so much. I think they're just really solid. And they might not be done acquiring, depth players this offseason. I think Golden State at plus 350, anywhere out to plus 500 or beyond, I think is a fantastic value. I think Golden State, personally, is my favorite to come out of the West right now. The other team I want to point out is Dallas. 17 to 1 to win the Western Conference. I think that's a really positive expected value bet. Luka Doncic, I think, is the most valuable trade asset in the NBA. Luka Doncic, I think, could easily be the MVP someday, and we'll talk about the MVP odds soon enough. We've seen it before where, James Harden, being as elite as he was, carried the Rockets as far as he did. Doncic could do something similar with Dallas. I think Dallas is a sneaky team to end up winning the Western Conference. And, there is a world where, after the 2020-2021 season ends, we're just unanimously saying Luka Doncic is the best player in the world. Like, there is a world where Doncic turns out to be that high caliber of a player. He's already clearly a top 10 guy. Obviously, there are some questions about, he's not quite, an elite shooter yet, not a great defender, but I think Dallas is a sneaky good one. 17 to 1 to win the West. I just think, they could take another big step, I think, in this upcoming season. So now for the Eastern Conference winners, I'm going to read off the East. Milwaukee's at plus 225. Brooklyn is at plus 300, which to me kind of implies that there's some James Harden rumor kind of baked into that number. Boston is at plus 500. Miami plus 550. Toronto is plus 1,000, and Philadelphia plus 1,200. Indiana 40 to 1. So I think the Eastern Conference is a lot trickier to predict than the Western Conference is, but there's one team that I do kind of like. I like the Miami Heat plus 550. They beat Milwaukee this past year. They beat Boston. They're bringing the same group back. Tyler Hero and Bam Adebayo, Duncan Robinson, these guys are only going to get better. From what it sounds like, they're going to retain Goran Dragic. Jimmy Butler is going to be there. They still have Spoelstra as their coach. I think Miami is just a really badass team, and I think they're going to be really good again next year. I think they're going to be another, case where they're a better playoff team than a regular season team. And, I am still under the impression that Miami would have won that series against the Lakers if their two most important guys hadn't gotten hurt. I mean, Dragic and Adebayo were, Adebayo came back later in the series, I guess, but he wasn't fully himself. Dragic, he just lost for basically the whole series. Miami still won 2 games against the Lakers in the finals without 2 of their 3 best players. And so I think this Heat team is getting undervalued. I think plus 550 to win the Eastern Conference is a good bet to make. And now I'll go to the NBA champion for the 2021 season. So the Lakers are the favorites at plus 350. The Clippers are at plus 600 for the Clippers. The Bucks are also 6-1. Golden State plus 700. Brooklyn plus 800. Boston plus 1200. Miami 14-1. Toronto 20-1. Dallas is 20-1. Denver 23-1. I think after that, it's not worth mentioning. So, based on my Western Conference and Eastern Conference bets, obviously, I really like Golden State plus 700 to win the NBA championship next year. I like them more to win the Western Conference, but plus 700 is a really good value. Plus 800 is available in some places. Just think back to around 2015, before they got Kevin Durant. This is almost the same team. Draymond has declined a little bit, but it's important to keep in mind that, these LA teams are not rested. Milwaukee's not rested. Golden State is the most rested good team in the NBA. I mean, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson literally took almost a year off together. The current bench of the Warriors is nowhere near as good as what they had when they were going to finals repeatedly. They still, I think, need someone to fill in the Sean Livingston role, and they need a guy like Iguodala to be a solid, rotational defender who can make threes. But those pieces aren't that hard to find out in the open market. I think Golden State could easily replace those, roles in their team this offseason. And, if you just think back to around 2015, Golden State having the fourth best odds to win the title, I mean, there's just kind of a disconnect there, I think, with the current market, where they're not respecting what the Warriors have done in the past quite enough. So I like Golden State plus 700 a lot. The only other ones that I would say you could sprinkle value on, as you can imagine, Miami 14-1, Dallas 20-1. I think those are the only two other ones that I really think are super positive expected value. But I'm expecting a decline for both LA teams relative to what they were last year for different reasons. But especially for the Lakers, if they lose Rondo, I think that's a really big loss. So yeah, I think this is a season where I'm going to be really in on the Golden State Warriors. And then finally, just to go over some MVP odds, there's three guys who I like. Luka Doncic plus 500, Steph Curry plus 700, and I'm going to throw in Kevin Durant, who is 16-1. If Brooklyn ends up being something like a 2 seed, I think that they're going to end up being worse than that, but Durant is still, probably one of the 5 best guys in the league, even coming off of his injuries, so I think that it's worth a dart throw at 16-1, but the two guys who I like a lot, Luka Doncic at plus 500 and Steph Curry at plus 700, I think those two have a lot of potential to win the MVP. I just want to fade guys like Giannis, who have already won a couple times, LeBron going into whatever it is, his 18th, 19th year, and also he has such a great teammate like Davis. I just think the better story might come around with a guy like Doncic or Steph Curry.